Joining us now for all of this, NBC Chief White House Correspondent Kristen Welker, right from the Rose Garden, NBC Justice Correspondent Pete Williams, who helped confirm all of the breaking news overnight, Washington Post Deputy National Editor Phil Rucker, former U.S. Attorney Barbara McQuaid, and Politico White House Bureau Chief Jonathan Lemire, host of Way Too Early and author of the new book out today, The Big Lie, Election Chaos, Political Opportunism and the State of American Politics After 2020. Well-timed, Jonathan. Kristen Welker, the president went straight back to work in the Oval Office and seemed very happy to be back there. He seemed energized after that speech. Sort of a victory lap for Paxlovid and for getting the shots and the boosters.
It was a victory lap that we just witnessed in the Rose Garden, Andrea. There's no doubt about that. And stagecraft was at work as well. President Biden emerging from the residence where he has been in isolation for the past 5 days, and then walking out to the Rose Garden, making his remarks, and then walking back into the Oval Office, underscoring that he is getting back to work. And officials who were gathered in the Rose Garden there with him, with the media, all applauded as he walked back in. But putting the focus on his message, Andrea, he used this as a teachable moment and, frankly, as a chance to tout his administration's response to COVID-19, the fact that hospitalizations are down 90%, he said. And he talked about three main pillars of the administration's response: testing as well as vaccines. He underscored the fact that he is vaccinated and twice boosted, and he encouraged anyone who is eligible to get a second booster shot to do so. So he really used his remarks for that reason as well. And then, of course, he talked about the fact that he used Paxlovid, that antiviral, and he has taken that for a course of 5 days, likely the reason why he tested negative so quickly and why his doctor is saying he will continue to test regularly at a more increased pace than before to monitor, because some small cases do see a recurrence when they take Paxlovid. I just want to make one more point, Andrea, which is that the president also used this as a chance to talk about how different his response was than his predecessor, former President Trump. He said, who got sick and who ended up in Walter Reed. He said the difference is vaccines. But of course, the political backdrop is lost on no one here, Andrea. Now, as the event wrapped up, we all shouted questions about the economy, the other big issue you're going to be talking about today. And he didn't take any of our questions, Andrea.
No, it would be very dangerous for him to talk about that before the Fed makes its move at 2 o'clock, indeed. So a rare sense of discipline, a very good discipline from the White House in the way they orchestrated this today. Thanks so much to Kristen Welker. And I want to turn to the DOJ and play a short clip of Phil, your colleague, Kara Linick, detailing her reporting, her exclusive reporting, which broke this wide open last night.
At least starting in early spring, the Department of Justice started to swing its attention fairly forcefully towards Team Trump. In April, the Department of Justice sought and obtained phone records, call data logs, if you will, for a series of Trump aides, allies, and senior officials in the White House, people who were with him and overhearing what he was saying and taking orders from him after the election until January 6th. And also include his chief of staff, Mark Meadows.
Phil, the Post reporting goes into detail on two principal tracks: seditious conspiracy and potential fraud that the DOJ could be talking to these witnesses about. They seem to be talking to them. Clearly, there's information coming from the defense bar or somewhere, not from the DOJ. But also, we now know that Meadows' phone records have also been obtained as long ago as April by the Justice Department. Phil?
That's right, Andrea. Those are the phone records of the former White House Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows, who was around the president in those days, including on January 6th, and who also played his own role in trying to move to overturn the election, flying to Georgia, trying to pressure officials in that state to overturn the result. So that's an important part of this inquiry. But my colleagues at the Post are reporting that prosecutors at the Justice Department are focusing on former President Trump's actions, his conduct, the things he was telling his lawyers, the things he was telling his advisors and others around him about this fake electors scheme, the campaign by Trump and his allies to overturn the results of the election in the run-up to January 6th, that this has become a part of the focus of the criminal probe. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're seeking to charge the former president, but it does mean that the emphasis of their investigation now includes the former president himself and is not limited to those around the former president.
And Barbara McQuade, the January 6th committee has not revealed any direct lines of communication from the former president to those extremist groups, the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, although it did reveal connections between those groups in the planning. So does the Justice Department have a better ability, certainly the subpoena ability and the ability to enforce subpoenas, to get to that kind of information? What more could they be doing?
Yes, Andrea. In addition to subpoena power that has some real teeth with the judge able to hold people in contempt if they refuse to comply, the Justice Department also has the power to use search warrants. That is something that the committee does not have. And search warrants are what are used to get the content of communications records. In that reporting we heard from Carol Leonnig, we heard that DOJ had obtained the call log data. Typically, that is a first step to finding out who called whom, and then using a search warrant to get the content of messages and text messages or email messages. And that can be a real treasure trove because that can be used to confront witnesses, and sometimes you can find some very damning admissions there. So I think that is one tool available to DOJ that the committee lacks.
And Pete Williams, we've also already seen that they used search warrants with Jeffrey Clark, with John Eastman.
Yes, I think the real lesson of this story here is how much the Justice Department is doing that we just don't know about. And we get these little glimpses whenever there's something like this where somebody's called before a grand jury and what they said eventually comes out. Witnesses can talk about what they say to a grand jury. It's the government officials who can't. So, I mean, I'm not sure exactly how this story got to the Post, but I do think that the Justice Department, while not commenting on it, doesn't mind the fact that it's out there because there's been this criticism that, well, you know, the January 6th committee is running the show and you're not doing anything. And I think this is a lesson that there's a lot more that goes on here that we don't. For example, in April, they were getting phone logs. So they're clearly doing a lot that we just don't know about. And I think, as Phil rightly points out, you know, you had this expanding circle. They start out, or this contracting circle, I guess I should say, starts out with the rioters themselves, then people who were kind of leading the rioters, then looking at these phony election slates, looking at the people who thought that up, then the people who were advising the president, and sort of narrowing the circle. And eventually you have to ask what the president himself was doing. And that appears what's happening.
And in fact, just hours before Carol broke this story and her colleagues, Josh Dawsey and others in the Washington Post, Lester Holt had sat down with Merrick Garland. And I think it was, you and I were both struck by how intentional and emphatic he was in these responses. And, of course, later we realized, you know, they were clearly aware that the Post was coming down with this. This is part of what that exchange between Lester Holt and Merrick Garland. His first big interview
There's been a lot of criticism, a lot of pressure that the DOJ is kind of behind the power curve here, behind the committee, not moving quickly enough on what appears to be solid evidence in some cases.
As I said, we have been moving urgently since the very beginning. We have a huge number of prosecutors and agents working on these cases. It's a fundamental tenet of what we do as prosecutors and investigators is to do it outside of the public eye.
Making that point entirely, and I noticed Lawrence Tribe, who was Merrick Garland's law professor at Harvard, among law professor for so many others, you know, who are now in the government and on the court, and he said that he has been among one of the critics, and he said it was very reassuring to see that interview, and it was very pointed in the way Merrick Garland answered Lester about what they are doing behind the scenes, as you point out, Pete.
Yes, and it doesn't mean that we know where they're going to end up, but it does mean that we know more about what the sort of questions and what they're looking at.